Star Trek Mission to Horatius Chapter 3 Back to the Stone Age. Captain James Kirk entered the transporter room, buckling on the weapons belt from which his phaser pistol hung. The others had already gathered. The transporter officer stood at the freestanding console, a technician next to him. On the circular platform of the transporter chamber itself, a large specimen box already stood on one of the 6 light panels. Kirk looked at his second-in-command. "Well, Spock, any opinions on where to touch down?" "Interesting question, Captain." The Vulcan looked down at his own phaser pistol. "General Order Number 1 restrains us from using our sophisticated weapons against advanced life forms, though it does not prohibit us from protecting ourselves against carnivora and such. However, it would seem unfortunate if we should materialize in the midst of one of those numerous herds of herbivorous animals, both for them and for ourselves. In scanning tapes of the America of the so-called Old West, I have sometimes pondered the question of whether a regiment of, say, the Civil War period could have withstood a stampede of a bison, buffalo, I believe they called them, herd numbering perhaps 1,000,000 head. "Could we have your opinion, Mr. Spock, without a dissertation on early American history?" the captain said dryly, giving his phaser holster a final adjusting pad. "It would seem to me, Captain, that we had better set down in a hilly, more barren spot where we would be less apt to be trampled to death before even our phasers were able to decimate the large animals that seem to graze on Neolithia." Kirk grunted a laugh. "You're obviously right, Spock." He looked at the transport officer. "Otherwise, there would seem to be little choice." "Yes, sir." The other peered into his screen and made adjustments. The captain, Spock, Sulu, the yeoman carrying her portable sensor computer recorder slung over her shoulder, and Ensign Chekhov mounted to their light panels. Chekhov loosened his phaser in its holster in readiness for a possible quick draw. Kirk said to the transporter officer, "Very well, mister." The other snapped a quick command to the technician, who dropped levers and threw the activating switch. A column of light gleamed above each transport panel, and the group faded, becoming transparent, and disappeared. They materialized in a small glade with wooded hills to each side, except one which enjoyed a stream of exceedingly clear water. Ensign Chekhov, ever security conscious, kept his hand a few inches from his phaser pistol. His eyes darted about. The others stood in open admiration, surveying the countryside. Even Spock was able to say, "Actually, most fascinating. I have visited Earth but seldom. However, this would seem almost a duplicate of the planet before the advent of technology." Sulu, in a hushed voice, asked, Have you ever been in the National Park of Kyoto?" Captain Kirk said, "Mr. Sulu, I have never even been in Japan, though I appreciate your aesthetic reaction. Nevertheless, I suggest we postpone appreciation of Neolithia's scenic beauties and proceed to take our task of discovering why this supposedly colonized planet is—" He was interrupted by a scream that temporarily froze them all, save possibly Spock, and then broke into a sound that could only be described as a dog-like barking. From a clump of trees across the glen, there erupted a savage figure mounted upon a horse-like quadruped and charging toward them at breakneck speed. The distance was but a few score yards. Yeoman Doris Atkins, veteran though she was, resorted to an instinct reaching back into the mists of antiquity. She gave a very feminine squeal. Sulu yelped, "Hey, look out!" Spock's eyebrows went up. Ensign Chekhov went into a gunman's crouch, and his hand blurred into motion. Captain James Kirk took a quick step forward and threw up Chekhov's gun hand so that the bolt burned blue into the sky. Then he pushed his junior officer to one side and to the ground, even as the rider was upon them. He threw himself to the other side, but not quickly enough to prevent the fur-clad rider his face a mask of unbelievable color from striking out at him. The savage screamed, "Kill!" and slashed with what seemed to be a riding crop. The blow caught the stumbling James Kirk across the cheek, raising an immediate welt. And then the rider was past him and heading for the forest beyond, crouched low over his horse's neck and shouting back his bark-like war cry. Chekhov was up on one knee, his phaser again at the ready, but his eyes, bewildered, were on his commanding officer. Kirk, his eyes narrow, snapped, "Mr. Chekhov, throw your sidearm on stun effect and bring that fellow down." The savage was almost to the trees, still barking his triumph. Ensign Chekhov brought up his phaser pistol and fired immediately when the weapon reached eye level. "Good shot," Sulu yelped in approval. The savage tumbled from his seat to the ground and remained motionless. Spock, Sulu, and Yeoman Atkins headed for him. Kirk paused long enough, however, to look at Ensign Chekhov. He said, "Mister, if I hadn't thrown up your gun hand, you would undoubtedly have killed him. I suggest that upon our return to the Enterprise, you review General Order Number 1. We have landed upon a planet colonized by mankind without, I might add, even so much as an invitation from the authorities, whoever they may be. The repercussions, were we to butcher any of the citizens, would reach all the way back to Starfleet Command." "Yes, sir," Chekhov said. "It seemed to me as though the man were attempting to kill us." "You should have looked closer, mister." Captain Kirk followed the others. "In the first place, you could hardly call the lad a man." Chekhov was taken aback as he stared down at the crumpled figure. Jim Kirk was obviously right. This was no more than a teenage boy clad in primitive furs, his face painted grotesquely. Spock's eyebrows were high. Kirk said, "Comments, Mr. Spock?" "Most interesting, Captain. The boy is obviously an Earthling. He is made up in war paint in the fashion of primitives. His armament seems to consist of nothing save a short stick. I submit, Captain, that in the early Indian days it was considered a greater honor on the part of a warrior to strike an enemy with a stick and count coup upon him, as the term went, than to kill him." The captain grunted. "Mr. Sulu, Mr. Chekhov, keep a keen watch. Possibly this ambitious youngster has companions. If they see him like this, they will assume him dead, and we have no reason to believe they haven't weapons more potent than sticks." Chekhov and Sulu drew their phasers. Kirk went on, "Yeoman, your tricorder, if you please. Do the sensors record any sign of intelligent life in the vicinity?" Yeoman Doris Atkins activated the large rectangular handbag-like device she had slung over her shoulder. After a brief moment, she shook her head. "No, sir. Some lower life forms, including the horse, it seems to have stopped about a quarter kilometer ahead, but no indication of intelligent life except us in this clearing. Mr. Spock, see what you can do about reviving the boy." The Vulcan bent down, and only his superior reflexes avoided the sudden snap of teeth in the direction of his outstretched hand. He jerked it back and came erect. "It would seem that would be unnecessary, Captain." The fur-clad Neolithian sat erect and glared defiantly at the Federation representatives grouped around him. "I am Grang of the Wolf Clan, and have no fear of death." He spoke in a most passable Earth Basic. In spite of the bravery of his words, there was a slight tremor in his voice. Captain Kirk said dryly, "And I am James of the Kirk clan, and have only the usual normal dread of death. So we seem to be even, boy. But why the attack upon us? Had I been a full warrior, armed with bow or spear, I would have slain you all." "Well, thank goodness for small favors," Sulu said sourly. The captain said, "That will be all, Mr. Sulu. At least the lad has courage." He turned back to the fallen young savage. "But why did you feel it necessary to attack us, Grang? We've done you no harm, and in fact, we've come to help you, assuming that this is where the distress call came from." Help us? The boy, seeing that evidently they had no immediate plans to harm him further, came to his feet and glared at the others. You have come to kill us, or capture us, and fly us away in your iron birds from the sky. Inadvertently, Kirk cast his eyes upward. However, the Enterprise's orbit was too high for the starship to be visible from this point. Spock murmured, "Most interesting." Kirk looked at him. Your opinion, Mr. Spock? Since Grang here cannot have observed the Enterprise, Captain, he manifestly must be referring to raiders from some other spacecraft. Why spacecraft? Why not local aircraft? You forget, Captain, that our sensors were able to detect no emanations that indicated technology on Neolithia of the order that could produce airplanes, even primitive ones. You're right, of course, the captain admitted. He looked at the boy musingly. The Neolithian was almost full-grown. In fact, his stature was about that of Sulu, the shortest of the Enterprise group. His figure was straight and lithe, and his features were open and clear-cut to the extent they could be made out through the heavy war paint. He hid the apprehension he must have felt and stared back at his captors defiantly. Kirk said gently, Son, I am not your son. We are not even kin. I am of the Wolf Clan, and... All right. Listen, Gray. We have no desire to harm you. However, we would like to speak to your authorities. We are on a mission of assistance and have no desire to kill or capture your people. The boy was obviously disbelieving, but he said, Authorities? Spock put in, Your chiefs, your headmen, your elders. Understanding dawned. You mean the Council of Patriarchs? Exactly, Kirk said. Now, if you'll lead us, certainly they can't be too far away. He frowned, in spite of the fact that the ship's sensor seemed not to have detected them. They will kill you all, Grang said defiantly. However, it was obvious the youngster was rapidly losing his original fear of these strangers. Chekhov cleared his throat wryly. Captain Kirk said, In which case you will have served your clan by delivering us up to them, Grang. The boy thought about it. Very well. I will lead you. You will all be killed by our warriors in vengeance for those you have kidnapped and killed in your many raids. Things are bad everywhere, Sulu muttered. However, he grinned at the boy, whose courage was obvious. The young savage turned and began to walk in the direction his horse-like animal had taken. Captain Kirk said, Just a minute. He brought his communicator from his tunic and flicked erect the antenna grid. He said, Kirk to Enterprise. Lieutenant Uhura here, Captain. A voice came back. Kirk said into his communicator, Please instruct Commander Scott to assume my command chair and to keep a fix on us. There are some developments here we plan to explore. Aye, sir. Kirk flicked the antenna grid down and returned the device to his tunic. All right, he said. Let's go. Grang, show us the way. Mr. Spock, follow immediately behind me. Keep your tricorder activated, tuned to detection of intelligent life. Yeoman, you follow Mr. Spock. Mr. Sulu, Mr. Chekhov, bring up the rear. Your phasers on stun effect. Remember, all of you, arrows and spears are quite as effective as the most advanced weapons so far as terminating life is concerned, if they are given the chance to be used. Yes, sir. Chekhov spoke as if his mouth were dry. They followed the youth, who proceeded down a forest path. After a quarter-kilometer, they came upon Grang's animal, which was grazing quietly. Grang whistled softly to the beast, which immediately came to him. Kirk said, You're free to go if you wish, but we're anxious to meet this council of patriarchs of yours, and surely our numbers are such that your clan need not fear us. Clan Wolf fears nothing, Grang said strongly, taking up his animal's reins, but making no attempt to mount. I'm beginning to believe him, Sulu muttered. Kirk said, All right, Grang, continue. They approached a lofty cliff, which the narrow path skirted, and proceeded possibly another quarter-kilometer before rounding a bend and pulling up abruptly. There before them loomed a large cave entrance. Grang turned defiantly. The cavern of the Wolf Clan, he said proudly. "Now all of you will be slain by our warriors." "Oh, fine," Sulu muttered. "I can hardly wait." Ensign Chekhov said in amazement. "You mean your whole clan or tribe, or whatever you call it, lives in this cave?" Kirk said, "Mr. Spock, your sensors?" The Vulcan shook his head. "Still no indication of human life, Captain. However, there is an interesting aspect." "Well?" Within the vicinity, there is a considerable radioactive element. If I were on the ship and had at hand the resources of the library computer. For the time, we will proceed, Mr. Spock. Perhaps later we can go into the broader aspects of the problems that present themselves here. He turned to the young savage. "Grang?" In the past half hour, the boy had lost some of his belligerence, since these strangers had not harmed him. In fact, he was obviously intrigued by them, their equipment, and the mystery of from whence they had come. He hesitated. "If I take you inside, you will be slain by the warriors." Kirk said, "Chance we'll have to take, Grang. I have already told you we wish you and your people no harm. Perhaps I can convince your patriarchs of that fact." Yeoman Doris Atkins winked at the boy. He blinked, taken aback by her smile. "We'll be all right," she said. "Don't worry about us." That seemed to set him back still further. It had evidently come to him that he was a bit apprehensive about these new companions of his coming to an unfortunate end. Other than their early scuffle, they had offered him nothing but kindness. Frowning, he turned and resumed, leading them into the wide mouth of the cave. Large as the opening was, the group from the Enterprise were still astonished by the tremendous size of the interior. Indeed, the mammoth cavern towered so high above them that the ceiling seemed to fade into the distance. The interior stretched back as far as the eye could see. Strangest of all was the almost phosphorescent quality of the rock of the walls and ceiling, so that, though dim, the cavern's interior was not truly dark. It was certainly light enough so that one could make his way without tripping. For a moment they stood immediately inside the entrance and peered before them in an attempt to accustom their eyes to the dim light. Kirk said, "Mr. Spock, your sensors?" "Astonishing, Captain. They seem to fail to function." "Yeoman?" "And mine, Captain," Doris Atkins said in puzzlement. "Evidently, we find why the ship's sensors were unable to detect life. The radioactive qualities present must blanket the sensors." The captain looked at their guide. "You mean your people are able to live in this atmosphere?" "We have done so," Grang said, his voice slightly surly, "ever since the raiders began to kill and capture us." Spock said, "You must realize, Captain, that all radioactive elements are not necessarily detrimental to life." Even as they talked and peered into the dimness of the cavern's interior, they heard the scurrying of feet, murmurs, and even faint calls of dismay. But now the Vulcan's words were interrupted by a shrill voice that called, "Grang!" Grang bowed his head and hunched his youthful shoulders. The voice shrilled, "Grang! You've led the enemy to your people! Prepare to die with them!" Grang's head came up. "No," he called. "They are not the enemy. They say they have come to help us." "Help us?" the voice shrilled all but hysterically. "They're not even members of our tribe! Prepare to die, youthful traitor!" Once again, young Grang proved himself no coward. His head high, he said strongly, "As a member of the Wolf Clan, I demand to be heard by the Council of Patriarchs, and on my totem pledge to abide by their decision." "What goes on here?" Sulu asked nervously. "Keep your hand away from your sidearm, Mr. Sulu," Kirk said. "All of you, if possible, try to smile. Our young friend seems to be going to bat for us. Don't do anything to hinder him." "Aye, aye, sir," Chekhov breathed unhappily. A figure approached them. At first, in the dimness, it was a seemingly unbelievable figure. The head was that of a monstrous black bat, wings and all. The body, small and shriveled, was covered with dark fur. Yeoman Doris Atkins sucked in her breath. As the creature came nearer, however, it became obvious that it was but a very old man, attired in a grotesque headdress made from the skin of a bat, and in some animal skin apparently unique to this world. His face was wrinkled with age, and there was a malevolent aura about him. "The wizard doctor," Grang murmured to them under his breath. "He is not truly a wolf, but of the clan shaman, which supplies the wizard doctors and wizard witches of all the clans of the tribe." The small figure hobbled nearer. "A mule of shaman clan, and an enemy of all raiders from space. Hence I curse you to death. And," Grang shouted, "I demand a hearing before the Council of Patriarchs. These people are my friends." Doris Atkins whispered, "Thanks, Grang. It was a nice try." But Captain Kirk said to the wizard doctor, "Our god is evidently not your own, mule, and it would seem unlikely that your curses would affect us. Take us to your council, since we have an important message for them and words of peace." The shriveled little man glared at him, saying finally, "We shall see, stranger from the skies, if the curses of shaman will apply to you. But meanwhile, the council shall judge." He giggled evilly under his breath and turned. The scurrying of feet in the background and the murmuring of many voices had fallen off. But now, about the wizard doctor, a score of tall, hefty spearmen, weapons in hand, materialized. They appeared to be older, larger editions of Grang, and like him, they wore ferocious-looking war paint. Handsome specimens, they stared emptily at the earthlings and Vulcan, but said nothing. The wizard doctor had spun on his heels, and now hobbling, he led the way down what was evidently a side corridor leading from the main hall of the cavern. And as he went, he chuckled. Sulu murmured, "He reminds me of a third-class villain in a third-class Tri-Dye show." And Chekhov muttered back, "Unfortunately, this isn't a Tri-Dye show, and frankly, I'm in no hurry to experience any of those curses our wizard doctor friend was bragging about." They made a turn here, a turn there, into one corridor, out to another, turn to the right, turn to the left. Kirk said to his first officer, "It occurs to me that Scotty up in the Enterprise has lost his fix on us. If your tricorder doesn't work under this pile of radioactive rock, I doubt if the ship's sensors do either." "The same thought occurred to me, Captain," Spock said without emotion. "The situation has most interesting aspects." "Mr. Spock, I sometimes suspect you will find interesting aspects about your own funeral. By the way, I assume you're memorizing these twistings and turnings?" The Vulcan raised his eyebrows. "But of course, Captain." Doris Atkins said, "I don't know about Mr. Spock, but I'm lost. I couldn't find my way back if it meant my life." "Which it probably will," Sulu growled. "I wouldn't think a seeing eye dog could get back through that maze." "That will be all," Captain said. "Remember, we're here on a mission of peace, and as captain of a starship, I'm legally an ambassador of the United Federation of Planets." "Yes, but have these people even heard of the Federation?" Sulu muttered. "Mr. Sulu." "Yes, sir." They emerged eventually into a long cavern hall, which happily seemed somewhat lighter than the corridors through which they had passed. Their guards stayed behind as they entered. The center of the hall was dominated by a great stone table set on 6 massive stone pillars. To the far side of it were seated 7 elderly-looking Neolithians on rough-hewn wooden stools. Messengers must have dashed ahead to warn them of the coming of the strangers, since they seemed fully aware of the situation. The oldest of all, who sat in the middle, said in a shaky voice, "Grang of the Wolf Clan, though not yet a warrior among the warriors, still has reached the age where by tribal custom he can demand a hearing before the Council of Patriarchs. If he is denied his plea, punishment up to death penalty may be decreed. Speak, Grang, you're charged with revealing our sanctuary to the raiders from the stars." Captain Kirk said quickly, "We're not raiders. We have come from afar to answer a call for assistance. I suspect from what you say that the assistance is needed against these so-called raiders from space. Was it you who issued the call?" Patriarch looked at him. "It is not you who are on trial, raider from space. But Grang, your fate has already been sealed. Your sentence is the silent death with which Mule of the Shaman clan will shortly administer. Speak, Grang. Grang was obviously standing before the highest-ranking authority of his tribal society, but he was not browbeaten. He said in a strong voice, I do not believe they are the raiders. I counted Kuwan the one who is known as Captain of the Kirks, but he took no vengeance on me. I believe they tell the truth, and thus I brought them to speak with the council. Perhaps they can truly help us against our enemies. Mule cackled his disgust at the opinion stated, but the head patriarch looked back at Kirk and his party thoughtfully. And how did you plan to help us against our enemies? Captain Kirk took a deep breath. As of now, we do not even know who they might be, but we have a powerful ship and weapons beyond any of which you know. As ambassador of the United Federation of Planets, I can point out the advantages of your joining this great confederation one day, But the old man was holding up a hand to silence him. Do not think us ignorant of Earth, the planet of our origin, Captain of the Kirks. Our bards still sing the sagas of Earth, and how our people first fled from there to this planet. Fled? Doris Atkins blurted out. The old man looked at her. To flee the large cities that clogged the atmosphere with fumes, to escape the machines that transported men at hundreds, then thousands of miles an hour, and finally at speeds unbelievable. The gods meant men to walk, or at most to ride on four-legged beasts. The gods designed men to eat the food of the fields, or the flesh of animals fresh from the hunters, not to partake of food from tins or frozen foods. Man is not a machine. He should not live among machines. He looked away, as though into a far distance. The bards sing us the sagas of how life was on Earth among devices enabling man to see or talk or hear 1,000 miles and more, devices enabling him to kill his fellow men by the million, man combating his fellow man in an inhonorable person-to-person combat for sufficient reason is one thing, but slaying the old and women and children, all with a tremendous explosion, this is blasphemy against the gods. Kirk said, with possibly a slight element of apology in his voice, many mistakes are made on man's path of progress, but progress he must. That species that slows down and stops eventually dies. The old patriarch was nodding. Perhaps you are right, but here on Neolithia, our people came to find the old way, the simple way, as nature intended it. And here we had found reasonable happiness until the coming of the raiders. Assuming your story is true, that you have come to help us, we refuse your help. We wish only to be left alone. Spock injected a question. And all this planet is the same. No industry, modern production, science, schools. The head patriarch frowned. Nowhere. The ancestors of all of us on Neolithia came in the original ship which transported them and then returned, and all are equally against what you call modern life. Most interesting, Spock murmured. The patriarch took a breath, and there seemed to be a trace of reluctance in his voice as he said, We have fled to this retreat, but now, through the traitor Grang, you have discovered it. We cannot allow you to leave, perhaps to betray us. Hence we must sentence you to the silent death. Mule! Kirk snapped. Chekhov, Sulu, Spock, alert! Of a sudden, the huge hall was filled with bowmen, scores, hundreds of Neolithian bowmen, arrows to the string and pulled back to the ear, ready for release. The odds were simply out of the question. The bowmen lined the walls, stood shoulder to shoulder upon ledges and in niches. The Enterprise group had apparently only seconds to live. Captain Kirk's eyes darted about, seeking escape, but there was nowhere to go. The entry through which they had come was blocked by the primitive, bow-armed warriors, and behind them, as far as the eyes could make out, were more warriors. Kirk let out in desperation, "Comments, anyone?" Sulu managed a hollow, bitter laugh. Grang had closed his eyes, his youthful face pale beneath his war paint. Spock said, a slight element of surprise in his voice, "Comments upon what, Captain?" Kirk looked at him. "We are under sentence of death, Mr. Spock. I expect that momentarily the order will be given for these bowmen to transfix us. Frankly, I can see no escape." Mr. Spock's eyebrows rose. "What bowmen, Captain Kirk?"